Hi, this is my review of Oubliette First Steps in the Dark. This is a novel based on the setting of Oubliette. If you haven't seen my review of that role-playing game, I'm going to put the link in the description below. I recommend that you check that out because the Oubliette setting is it's one of the most original settings that I have seen in role-playing games. Perhaps in any sort of media, although it does have some elements from other settings. It's still very well put together. It's quite fascinating. So I recommend that you watch my review of the Oubliette role-playing game if you haven't done so yet. In this review, I'm going to be telling you things about the different short stories because this is a compilation of short stories in the most subtle way possible because I don't want to give away any spoilers. I want this to be a spoiler-free review so you can purchase the novel and enjoy the plot developments, the surprises, the twists and turns. Now let's talk about the quality of the PDF. You can also obtain this book as a physical book. It's on print on demand in Drive-Thru RPG. Well, the quality, I only have one criticism, and it's that I did spot a few typos. They won't present an important obstacle when understanding the content, but there are quite a few here and there. But besides that, everything else is great. The book is fully bookmarked. Everything is well written. I really like the writing style. It gets quite immersive and surreal at the same time. It was quite pleasant to read overall. It's one of those books that you start reading and suddenly you notice that you already read like 10 or 20 pages and it went by just like that. So in general the quality is good despite those typos. And there aren't any illustrations besides the cover. Now let's talk about, and forgot to mention, the table of contents is also hyperlinked. Let's talk about the content, the short stories themselves. The Oubliette is quite abstract. You have this dimension where people from any place, any universe, any planet, any other dimension arrives at when they die. So in Oubliette you can find anything. You could find medieval warriors, you could find aliens that use high tech, you could find people from history, from planet Earth or from other planets. Anything goes in Oubliette. So I think the greatest challenge is to get adjusted to this strange world where anything could happen and where there is a different sense of logic, where laws of time and space and physics and chemistry simply do not apply. It's an entire new reality. And it's pretty nice at the beginning because you get a foreword from the author explaining like his philosophy behind the writing. You really need to get a good sense of what he's trying to communicate, and you are assisted in that by the addition of paragraphs at the beginning of each short story. That is, he's going to tell you all about each of the short stories at first, and that is really useful because sometimes things get so abstract and surreal and dreamlike that you really need like a foothold or some sort of anchor to try to make sense of things. So I think it's great that he added a paragraph with his philosophy behind each of the short stories. Although I think you could also make sense of the short stories without those paragraphs. It's just a really nice addition. And in this book you will find all sorts of stories. Stories that have to do with good old-fashioned high fantasy battles. They have to do with infiltration. They have to do with perhaps a bit of romance, not too much. It's more like relationships between the different characters. They form these connections, and what I like about those connections is that they do not feel forced. That is, you could see some friendships. It's somewhat hard to tell at times when there is actually like a hint of romance. You're not exactly sure. Mostly it's about friendship and understanding that they are living in this strange dimension for perhaps centuries or even thousands of years, millions of years, because Oubliette is eternal. If you can keep on dying and dying and dying, and you will still come back to a sort of state of life. It's somewhat hard to describe it in Oubliette. And as long as you do not get crushed by a sense of despair or lack of purpose, you will keep reviving or resurrecting, and you won't become hollow like a broken individual. You become part of some like a mindless puppet, so to speak. Even though in Oubliette there are actually puppets with a sense of awareness or sentience, but those that keep on dying and they get their dreams and hopes crushed, they just become like a part of the background, like some sort of a non-player character or NPC that is just there to sometimes serve as an obstacle or danger to the more aware inhabitants of the Oubliette. There are actually some rare cases in which they can actually snap out of that state, but as you read through the different short stories, you really appreciate the value of being aware of how valuable being just perceptive of the world around you is, how to keep on going, having a sense of purpose, keep that drive up. So I think that is expertly communicated in the short stories. After the foreword, telling you a bit of this short story collection, you have what would be the beginning or the seed of the only solid plot line or plot arc in the book. That is, all of the short stories, for the most part, are disconnected. They are standalone stories, but you do have some references to characters that appear in some of the other stories. But with this prologue of this main character, which is a sort of like witch or sorceress type of character, Lucette the Agnès, she's on a mission, on a quest. And just, I'm telling you, I went to avoid giving things away, because I think one of the most wonderful things about these short stories is how you start to piece together or make sense of the entire stories and mysteries. But she basically arrived at Oubliette being quite a cynical person. And thanks to this interaction with another character, she started to soften up a bit of gaining that human touch or quality. And because of her actions, she actually put this other character in danger. So now she's on a mission, no matter how long it takes, hundreds or thousands of years, she wants to make things right. You can get a feeling that she made a really strong connection with that character, and she will do anything possible to rescue that character. So in the first stories, you can see a thread, a connection. You will see characters that are based on people in a real world that supposedly died and ended up in Oubliette. Maybe there are more references that I am not aware of, but you can see some characters that were obviously living in planet Earth, and perhaps there are other references that I did not identify, but you get like a nostalgic sense of things. You can see how characters have been struggling for a bit. Even if they have lived hundreds of years in Oubliette, they are still adapting, and some of them have actually gotten used to the world. They carry on with their day-to-day activities. I think it's going to be pretty useful if you're not familiar with the setting of Oubliette. It would be quite useful to have the role-playing game book at hand, or the file open, so you can look for those things that you cannot identify, because you will see names of different species and races and monsters and beings and places, and you may not remember all of it. So you'll have a good experience by identifying those references in the role-playing game book. But that's not entirely necessary. That is, maybe you have never played or read the Oubliette Core Rulebook, and you still want to read these short stories. You can do it. You won't get too lost, because this is actually, as I said, a very deep and complex setting. You will only struggle a bit when they say the names of places and species that they do not fully describe how they look, how they act, why they act the way they do. that is explained in the core rulebook, but as you start to read the short stories, you'll start to make sense of things. That is, sometimes the stories get pretty self-explanatory despite those obscure references. So you can see different stories that have to do with wizard type of characters. You can see how there are some very strong personalities in Oubliette. For example, Vlad Tepes is actually one of the characters that ended up in Oubliette, although there is a big mystery concerning Vlad's position and powers that is also hinted at in the core rulebook. But here you will see Vlad Tepes, and he's quite powerful. He's pretty unstoppable as they portray him. You really get a good sense of risk because Vlad, being who he is, if you get captured by Vlad, he's not just going to kill you, because in Oubliette you are pretty much immortal. He can arrange that, especially because of the use of magic, that you could end up impaled and then being kept alive, tortured for as long as he wants. So even though you can revive, it's not always a sure thing that your mind is going to survive the ordeal. So you can see how Lucette, through the course of different short stories, she's kind of like bending this or creating this team together, getting people together to rescue this other character. I enjoyed a lot of the stories, all of the stories in fact, but there was one that felt quite particularly touching in the sense of a character that has a strong sense of duty. You see, it's one of the Shell Kings. These guys that were supposed to be sort of like an aristocrats that are dressed in huge metal armor. They are kind of like decadent aristocrats or nobility in Oubliette. And this particular Shell King, he has a very strong sense of protecting the world of Oubliette. He's constantly moving through very dark places alone, and he's hunting down all sorts of horrors. So much so that it's his everyday life, and you can see how he will encounter this other character, and that character is going to be mentored by him, and you can see a really cool transition of how he's teaching that other character what he knows, and how to become the new protector, potentially new protector, keeping Oubliette safe from all sorts of monsters. And you can also see how the things that you carry with you, your weapons, your armor, your gear, even your very body, is changed depending on what you are doing, how you act, and the places that you are visiting in Oubliette. You know, it reminds me a bit of that. I think it was a game for Xbox 360, Circle of Fire. That was a pretty, well, it was a decent game, but I think this story was interesting in that the characters were in this strange world. It was somewhat like a limbo or dream-like world, and their bodies changed according to their own ideals. So you could see this knight. I actually forget a lot of the names. I'm not actually a fan of the series, but that game, I really liked it. It's just that I forgot about all the names. So you see this character is sort of like a knight, and he, because he has these ideals of being noble and honorable, he starts to become shape-shift into some sort of human griffin hybrid of sorts. And there is another character that starts to become quite demonic, because at the same time he's quite driven by dark desires. And the funny thing is that there is actually this other character. He's really fat and bald and ugly and old, and he actually thinks that he's the best thing that there is, that he's actually really handsome and such. And because of his firm belief, or perhaps that twisted sense of perceiving reality, he actually is not transformed, because he thinks he is the ultimate state of perfection. So that's really funny. So in Oubliette, it's kind of the same. You can see characters that are being constantly reshaped and formed. So for example, in the case of the Shell King or Knight that I was telling you, his protege or apprentice eventually becomes completely different from when that character first started, physically and mentally. I think some of the most exciting parts of the different short stories are the things that have to do with urgency, rescuing something, destroying something, defeating someone. And sometimes, because in Oubliette, life is so difficult due to the insane amount of power that some beings possess, that sometimes the only way you can accomplish some things is by actually dying. So you can see the characters already planning ahead, thinking, oh, I'm going to die in this mission, it's going to be awful, I need to plan ahead of where I'm going to appear at, because when you die, you appear at some places where you feel a certain attachment, or maybe due to some other type of magical circumstance, and they are already planning ahead for when they actually die. And the greatest fear is that, which I was telling you, not getting captured and tortured for almost eternity, or perhaps eternity. So I think those types of encounters and missions are really exciting. Sorry. mm, you can also see some noir investigation type of moments in Oubliette. There's actually a really cool story featuring Theory Entropy. He's kind of like Entropy, like a werewolf, and he is trying to piece together or make sense of the mystery of his own death, his most recent death, because he doesn't remember anything. So it's a very interesting overall, and you try to make sense of things with him, try to figure out why he was killed or who killed him and why he can't remember anything. It's a story that really feels like a noir drama of sorts, and it's really, the battles are quite awesome. I think these are some of the best high fantasy battles that I have read about. Perhaps they do not get too technical in, for example, in battle techniques or methods, but the description of the magical spells, the how the characters move and attack and dodge and parry, it feels quite real within this surrealness. I really enjoyed that. You can also see how different characters try to make a living out of anything and everything. You can see some, for example, pirate type of affairs with a god from another world that ended up in Oubliette, and he is actually, even as a god, he is discovering that he has some other powers that he didn't know he could enact or enforce in the world of Oubliette. He basically has control over bacteria, so he uses those powers in a very creative way most of the time. Perhaps I would have liked it if the main story arc of Lucette trying to rescue this character, I would have liked it if that story arc continued through the entire collection of short stories, but because it ended up with a cliffhanger. Just, well, you could say that some things reached a conclusion, but there is like a thread that was still open. Perhaps, I don't know if they will continue the story, but I would have liked it if the story was continued in the other short stories, because later on you have bonus content, which are basically disconnected short stories, and these feel a lot more abstract. The other ones, you can see how it has an identifiable plot line of how the characters are going to act, where they are going to go, and their origin stories, perhaps just hints of how they started living in Oubliette, and you start to follow an interesting chain of events. But in the bonus content, it feels even more standalone and more poetic. Another story that I liked of the story arc part is when you see these giants trying to survive just outside a certain area around the wall. Things get quite brutal. Even for a giant, you can see how things are difficult if you encounter not only other giants, but also beings that, even though they are smaller, they are quite powerful, insanely powerful. So even if you are a giant and you have all that brute strength, life in Oubliette, it's still quite difficult. You can also see some taboos connected to corpses. When you die, your corpse still exists somewhere in Oubliette, and sometimes you encounter your corpse. Sometimes they put laws if you can pick up the corpse of your enemies or even your own corpse, and sometimes you actually could start a war between factions depending on the treatment that is being given to the corpses. I also like it that some of the stories, they do not all have a happy ending, and you have to accept the changes to make sense of the world as a whole, or of Oubliette as a whole. Because, for example, sometimes you will see these minor characters and maybe you won't pay too much attention to them. Maybe you will see a character and you will say, oh, he's just like a background character of sorts, but suddenly you start to see that that character goes through some sort of radical transformation, and now that character is the main character, or one of the secondary characters rather, in some of the other stories. Even if they have abandoned that rescue story arc that I was telling you about, you can see the same secondary character that is only appearing in other short stories. You can also see how some characters have such a bleak outlook that they just abandon their sense of living self, and they actually become some sort of undead. Even in Oubliette, you can become a sort of undead creature, and some of them, they just embrace the coldness of the grave, and they end up being ghosts or like intelligent undead of sorts. It depends on the transformation. So I also think that was very well portrayed. I think the moments where some characters had disturbing revelations of their past within Oubliette, and even when they were alive in some other planet, particularly in planet Earth, I think it's also very well expressed and communicated. I also think that the alliances that happen in Oubliette are very surprising, and they have this sort of bohemian or melancholic or artsy process or style to them. You can see that making friends is not exactly easy, but some characters, because they share the same goals and purpose, they start to band up, and suddenly they start to make some connections. Sometimes those connections feel really strong, but when the mission is over, they just like part ways, and they are like, oh well, I will see you in 1,000 years, or maybe in a million years, who knows. And sometimes you actually see some characters, for example, in the case of Lucette, she encounters this other character. I forgot his name. Let me see if I can find his name over here. His name escapes me, but Lucette basically encounters another character, and it seems like thousands of years have happened. They went by between them, and sometimes like they have this little rendezvous or encounter, and they meet up and they perhaps exchange information or act together for something, and then they separate once more. But because of some comments that Lucette says at the end of that story, you wonder if there's something more, some greater connection between them that was not revealed. You also get a good picture of the conflicts and alliances between the factions. They can get the interactions can get quite violent at times. Other times they have to like mend things and try to make things proceed a bit more smooth. There are also some strong horror elements in these short stories. Not too much that you're going to feel like terrified, but some, and not too disturbing. But there are some moments that you do not expect in a typical high fantasy adventure, as portrayed in most of the stories here. You can see some characters that are quite monstrous, but even more monstrous are the secrets that they are hiding. There are moments of suspense. There's a really cool short story with this character that is able to look into the future, like a few minutes into the future, and when she is facing off against this monstrous enemy, it's alarming when she looks into the future and she sees so many ways and she is dying when she doesn't take the right choice. So she's like constantly shuffling her clairvoyance or way of seeing into the future, trying to find just the right outcome so that she doesn't end up killed or worse, because here there are some beings that can actually erase memories from you, which could be considered worse than death. There is actually a market for memories. You can even, for example, if a character feels that he has too much emotional baggage, he can actually have those memories or emotions extracted, and they could be sold to someone who actually wants to see those disturbing visions or something that was somewhat disquieting. And this actually has a purpose, because some secrets can only be obtained if you have access to a particular memory. Even though that memory may not be too pleasant, sometimes only secrets can be obtained by digging through all of that emotional garbage. So, overall the book is quite pleasing. What do I think overall of Oubliette First Steps in the Dark? I think this collection of short stories is well worth reading, even if you do not play the Oubliette role-playing game, I highly recommend that you give these stories a read through. They will serve as inspiration, particularly for role-playing games that have to do with other worlds, with completely different realities. You will have many things concerning high fantasy as well, classic high fantasy even, but it's a lot better if you use these stories as inspiration for role-playing games with a very strong surreal tone or flavor to them. And even if you do not play role-playing games, it's an enjoyable collection of short stories. I think the only people who will not enjoy these short stories are those that want something that is too just completely meat and potatoes in terms of high fantasy, that you have this world that despite having magic all over the place and all sorts of creatures, fantastical creatures, you still have like an identifiable concept of gravity, of living and dying, of things that you would expect to find in planet Earth, despite all of the high fantasy trappings. But if you're looking for something that shakes you up a bit, you have to readjust to concepts of living in entirely different dimension, I highly recommend that you get Oubliette First Steps in the Dark. Well, thanks for watching this review. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know. See you later.